A Visayan war fleet sank 47 Spanish ships in a single month. The source for that number is a Spanish military report. The losing side is doing the counting. That year does not appear once in the Philippine K-12 history curriculum. And the reason is not what most people assume. Before going any further, set aside the idea that this is a cover-up story. It is not. The curriculum gets a lot right about the colonial period. Magellan's arrival in 1521 is documented in detail. Legaspi's establishment of colonial administration in the 1560s is covered. Lapu-Lapu's resistance at Mactan is taught, celebrated, and deserves to be. It is a real event, genuinely recorded, and the pride attached to it is earned. Nothing in this video argues that those events are wrong. The problem is not what the curriculum includes. The problem is the specific gap between Legaspi's consolidation and the Galleon trade era. There are decades in that gap. Decades when something was happening in the Visayan maritime zone that the textbook skips past in a single sentence, or skips entirely. What was happening in those decades is the subject of this video, and the Spanish military record is very specific about it. The war vessel at the center of this story is called the Caracola, double outrigger design, built for shallow coastal water, capable of carrying between 40 and 100 warriors depending on configuration. Spanish military correspondence from the 1560s through 1600s describes it in terms that read less like a military assessment and more like a complaint. Colonial reports note that a Caracola could encircle a Spanish galleon before the galleon could come about to fire. The hydrodynamic advantage was real and documented. The outrigger design kept the hull low and fast in conditions where a deep-drafted European vessel became slow and exposed. A Spanish galleon needed a deep water port and months of resupply. A Caracola fleet could sustain operations from any beach. The modular construction made the tactical problem worse for the colonial side. A Caracola fleet could be assembled, deployed, and dispersed faster than colonial reinforcements could arrive from Manila. The 47-ship engagement lasted a month, not because the Visayan fleet was slow, but because it was never in one place long enough to be decisively engaged. Colonial administrators wrote about this with visible frustration. They could not pin the fleet down. Every time a Spanish response force arrived at the last reported position, the Caracolas were already operating in the next strait. That engagement was not a raid. Spanish records describe it explicitly as a coordinated blockade of a specific strait, a deliberate, sustained operation designed to make a particular colonial shipping route economically unviable. That is not piracy. That is a military strategy. And the fleet executing it was not a disorganized tribal force. It was a coalition of barangay-level maritime polities spanning Cebu, Leyte, Samar, Bohol, Panay, and Negros, a network operating under a shared naval tradition that predated Spanish contact by centuries. At peak recorded mobilization, the Visayan Confederation fleet could field hundreds of coordinated vessels across multiple straits simultaneously. The command structure ran through Datu networks, meaning that if the Spanish managed to neutralize one node of the fleet, the rest continued operating. Colonial administrators read this as chaos. What they were actually observing was decentralized resilience, a command architecture specifically suited to a maritime environment where no single headquarters could be held or defended. One or two of the Datus who coordinated the 47-ship campaign are named in Spanish military correspondence. They are named in detail. The hostile documents describe their operational reach: multi-island coordination, kinship network mobilization, sustained tempo across hundreds of kilometers of open water over a full month of continuous operations. By any functional definition, these are military commanders running a military campaign. In Spanish military correspondence, they are treated as a serious strategic problem. In any Philippine history textbook, their names do not appear. Not once. The Spanish could not defeat this fleet in battle. The Caracola's speed advantage and the fleet's dispersal tactics made a decisive naval engagement nearly impossible. So the Spanish found a different solution, and it had nothing to do with fighting. The solution was a piece of paperwork. The Datu commanders were reclassified, not defeated, reclassified. The same administrative apparatus that governed colonial Manila issued a legal designation. The Visayan fleet commanders were not military officers engaged in warfare. They were pirates engaged in criminal activity. This was not a small semantic distinction. Under colonial administrative law, a military conflict required formal recognition, formal records, and entry into the Historia General, the official colonial narrative of events. A piracy suppression operation required none of that. It was a police matter. Police matters were filed in administrative logs, not military history. The fleet won the battle. It lost the archive. That reclassification had a direct and traceable downstream effect. Events classified as piracy suppression were not recorded in the Colonial Historia General. They were filed as administrative police records in the alcalde and audiencia reports flowing to Manila. Those records were not treated as military or political history. When the Philippines gained independence, the documents transferred to the Philippine National Archives were selected based on colonial categorization. Administrative police logs from suppression operations were not part of that transfer. The documents that recorded the 47-ship engagement stayed in Seville, in the Archivo General de Indias, filed under suppression of maritime disorder, not under military history of the Visayan zone. The fleet was not erased by fire. It was misfiled. But there is a second layer to this, and it operates on the ground rather than in the archive. The relocation policy. Spanish colonial policy applied systematically in the Visayan Islands from the 1570s onward, required coastal and riverine populations to relocate into consolidated Christian settlements inland. The stated purpose was taxation and religious conversion. But the documented side effect was the physical separation of communities from the shorelines where vessel building and naval training happened. The correlation in the colonial record is direct. In every area where relocation was implemented, Spanish military correspondence stops recording Caracola fleet activity in that region within 2 generations. Not because the Spanish defeated the fleet there, because the communities that built and crewed the Caracos had been moved away from the coast. The knowledge required to build a war-grade Caracola was not written in any manual. It was embodied, held in the hands and judgment of builders in specific coastal communities. When those communities relocated, the knowledge did not travel with them in any recoverable form. It died with the generation that moved. Now bring this forward to 1982. The Philippine Ministry of Education began standardizing the K-12 history curriculum. The process ran through 1987. The Curriculum Committee worked primarily with sources available in Filipino and English through the National Historical Commission. The Archivo General de Indias in Seville, where the Spanish military correspondence describing the 47-ship campaign sits, was not systematically translated or indexed for Philippine curriculum use during this period. It was not a political decision to exclude those documents. They were simply not accessible in the languages and formats the curriculum standardization process was built to use. The result is a textbook gap that falls precisely between the curriculum's coverage of Magellan's arrival and its coverage of the Galleon trade. The years of peak Visayan fleet activity land in a documented blind spot. The committee did not choose to skip them. The archival sorting system that the Spanish built, which pre-categorized Visayan naval operations as criminal suppression rather than military history, had already done the filtering, decades before anyone in Manila sat down to write a curriculum. This is verifiable. The DepEd K-12 Curriculum Guide for Grade 5 Araling Panlipunan is a public document. It lists the primary sources used to build the pre-colonial and early colonial period sections. That list contains 0 primary source documents describing Visayan naval operations from the Visayan perspective, not a partial record. 0. Anyone with internet access and the Curriculum Guide PDF can check this right now. The second verifiable fact comes from the University of the Philippines Visayas. Their ethnographic recovery project has been documenting what happened to traditional boat-building knowledge in Ridachan-affected communities across the Visayan Islands. The finding is unambiguous. In those communities, the knowledge required to build war-grade traditional vessels must now be reconstructed from Spanish-era illustrations. No living oral tradition survived. The break is complete. The researchers are working from colonial drawings to recover what coastal communities once knew by hand. The history is not closed, the research is active, but the continuity is gone. So here is what actually happened. A Visayan war fleet ran a strategic blockade that sank 47 colonial vessels across 1 month of coordinated operations. The Spanish could not counter it militarily. They countered it administratively, by reclassifying the commanders from military officers to criminals, removing the entire event from the category of warfare, and filing it in records that were never transferred to the national archive of the country it happened in. Then the relocation policy relocated the coastal communities whose embodied knowledge made that fleet possible, and within 2 generations the vessel-building tradition was gone. Then a curriculum standardization process in the 1980s built Philippine history education on top of a colonial archival system that had already pre-sorted those events out of the military record. 3 separate mechanisms. Each one sufficient on its own to produce the gap. Together, they made it nearly invisible. Your ancestors did not lose. They won a military engagement so effectively that the other side refused to classify it as a war. The erasure was not fire, it was paperwork. The Datu commanders who coordinated that campaign are visible today only in the documents of the force they were defeating, named in hostile correspondence, unnamed in any textbook. The fleet was not defeated, it was relabeled. And the relabeling was precise enough that the descendants of those sailors spent 40 years in a school system that never told them the year it happened. That changes the moment you know it. Which other years does the curriculum skip? And is there a pattern to which ones were left out? Put your guess in the comments. The answer is longer than one video. Share this with someone who was taught the gap was empty.